Hi, I'm Jacqueline.
And I'm Courtney, and this is Caffeinated Crimes.
You know, I used to always be a one plan, one big event, a weekend type of girly, right? This weekend I had plans all 3 days and it's just a lot. It's too much. We really
Mm-hmm.
I
Do
gotta
you
get
see
away
why
from
I'm
that.
tired all the time?
I don't know how you do it and how you've done it for like I had like a decade of like very limited social life, so that helped. And now it's like the whole decade's worth in the last 6 months is just,
Mm-hmm. Crammed in.
you know, yeah, which is great because I love spending time with my loved ones, but it's also exhausting because sometimes I just want to sit at my house all day and do nothing.
Mm-hmm.
But
Yeah, I get that. I say no sometimes because I'm like, I'm not leaving my couch today. And sorry, don't care what the invite is. I'm not leaving.
unless it's like a super good invite, like it could be something that like you're like, I would say no to everything except for this one specific thing that is like the most awesome thing in the world.
I mean, yeah. I mean, it depends. But if someone's like, do you want to come over? No.
Like, no thanks. But we could be
No, I'm
lazy
good.
on my couch together instead of being lazy on our own couches separately.
Yeah, but my couch
You're
and
like,
my
okay, you just
cats.
bring your couch and your cats and we
That sounds really. Why don't you come to my house at this point?
perfect. I'll bring my toddler for your stairs that are not toddler proofed and
And my
she's
cats who are
mastered.
around, no one else.
Yeah.
So,
Yeah, but she's mastered stairs at this point that I think she would be okay and would not tumble headfirst down the stairs. But you never know. So
yeah, you
I'm not
never
gonna
know
take any
because then a cat
chances.
gets under her feet, all bets are off. So,
That's true. That is true. This was not my best intro because again, my brain is fried from this very busy weekend
Jacqueline's
because
intro is I'm so busy. Listen to how tired I am. She's like, I'm
pretty
so
much
popular.
like I don't even know what to talk about. Like I was cleaning up the kitchen before I came in here to record. I'm just like, what is my intro? What's interesting? What's new? I don't know. I don't know. I don't have time to think. I'm just doing things all the time.
Well, it's okay because you know what? We don't have to have a lot of banter this episode. We can just get straight into those updates.
Yes, we should do that. So the Courtney's like, just stop talking. So the first one,
I'm just trying to make sure this doesn't derail. There's some
yeah,
people out there who probably don't like banter, and if we don't have good banter that's coming natural, let's just get on with it.
that is a great point, Courtney. Let's do it. So the first major update this week, which at this point is probably very old and there's probably new information. But
Hmm.
there was this woman named Carly Russell. I'm sure you guys have heard of her. So she like sees this toddler like walking alone at night. She calls 911, then she calls a family member, and then I've seen reports that say like it kind of went staticky and then like maybe they heard a scream in the background and then they didn't hear anything. Authorities went to the location where she called about the toddler. There was no toddler there, but they did find like some of her personal belongings and her purse and her cell phone and things like that. So of course everyone's like looking for her, like what happened to her. We hear a lot of stories of people using like children as decoys of like, oh, putting a baby carrier on the side of the road to kidnap someone because a lot of women will pull over to check on the baby. So people are wondering like, is that what's happening? And then 2 days later, she just mysteriously returns home on foot at like 11 p.m. She says that she was abducted by a man who took her to some house where a woman was there and like fed her cheese and crackers. And then they tried to put her in another vehicle and then she managed to escape and then walk home. So at this point, a lot of people are okay, something is kind of iffy here. I don't really know what's going
Hmm.
on. And then they did find that she had searches for the movie Taken, which is about women who are abducted. She asked, do you have to pay for an Amber Alert? How do Amber Alerts work? Lots of those questions that had been searched on her phone the day she was allegedly abducted. So, as of this point, on July 23rd, as we are recording this, there's not any additional information other than that, but things do seem a little suspicious. So, not really sure where that's going to go and what more we're going to hear about that. But pretty big case in the true crime world this week.
Yeah, kind of a weird situation. Don't really know what
Mm-hmm.
happened. I'm sure we'll hear more as time goes on, but Just kind of one of
Yeah.
those weird things.
Yeah. Very strange.
We also have another update in the Long Island serial killer case is someone has been arrested. So I think he's mainly been arrested for like the 4 like Gilgo Beach murders. And then there's like
Hmm.
other women they think is associated probably with him and like is the same person, but they don't know for sure yet. They're still like investigating, but like Rex Huberman was arrested. And it basically seems like they've had all the evidence for 13 years, but the old police chief was a literal piece of shit and nothing happened. So now a new police chief comes in, he created a task force and there's an arrest like immediately.
Which is just absurd. Like, ugh.
And it's wild too. I don't know if anyone here also listens to The First Degree, but they just did a 3-part series on the Long Island serial killer. And one of the girls also has a whole separate podcast about, she has like it's like multiple episodes about it.
Hmm.
Because she's like from Long Island, like really like close to her or whatever. And then they were doing this like fundraiser with like all the victims, like releasing little short episodes about each individual victim. And they'd partnered with like a jewelry brand who was like making necklaces with the money went to like this organization. And like literally dead middle of them doing this, the Long Island serial killer is arrested.
Wow.
Like crazy. So
Yeah, that is crazy.
there's a lot of evidence. Like I think they were saying like probable possible DNA evidence, all this. It kind of lines up when his wife was traveling, when like the murders occurred. His wife has like already been like, yo, fuck that man. I want nothing to do with him. She had no clue,
Hmm.
kind of thing. But basically, one of those like 13 years unsolved, multiple victims, could be more victims, everything like that. And now we have an arrest in that case.
Yeah, so that is huge news and just so heartbreaking for the families that have waited so long for some kind of justice. And then you find out, like, oh, we could have had answers a long time ago, if not for this person who clearly just did not care, which is like, get a new profession if you cannot find it in yourself to care about something like that, you know?
Yeah, well, from what I heard from them, it was like he was also sleeping with like sex workers and doing like shady shit. And so he was like trying to get the FBI to not come in because he was like,
Hmm.
didn't want everything he was doing to be like found out. So
Yeah.
who knows how many more unsolved cases there are across the country because of situations
Exactly.
like this.
Exactly. And I feel like we've talked about so many cases too where there's a lot of information that we like have and things that we maybe don't have the full picture, but we know that there is some information and we're like, how with all of this have you not been able to make an arrest? And so it very well could be a similar situation and other
Mm-hmm.
cases like that as well. So but yeah, those are our updates for this week. Today is a little bit of a longer episode. So, like Courtney said, we're just going to jump on in. Pretty wild story for you guys today. So, our sources for this week included a book called Alone, Orphaned on the Ocean by Richard Logan and Terry Duperrault Fassbinder, as well as an article from All That's Interesting and a historydaily.org article. So Dr. Arthur Duperrault was a prominent optometrist from Green Bay, Wisconsin, and he had long dreamed of taking his family on a week-long cruise from Florida to the Bahamas. He was always a leader. He was president of his senior high school class in 1939 at Green Bay West High School. He had also been a debate champion there. After high school, he went to Lawrence College, which is now called Lawrence University in Appleton, Wisconsin. But when World War II started, Arthur dropped out of Lawrence in 1942 to join the Navy. So he was a pretty thin guy and he had to gain some weight before the Navy would accept him. So working out did become a regular part of his routine. And even after his years in the Navy, he still would work out regularly. So after basic training, Arthur was assigned to Southeast Asia, where he served as a medical corpsman on the Burma Road, which is the supply line from the British colony of Burma to the interior of China. So the time spent here is where he found his love for the ocean. He was used to lakes, but he discovered that he loved the ocean significantly more. Arthur spent long hours on the deck of his ship and just like staring out into the horizon. And in his time with the Navy, he traveled with the men, treating them for malaria and dysentery, as well as wounds from jungle fighting with Japanese invaders. He spent 20 months in this area and then was assigned to duties in Washington, D.C. And in February of 1943, he volunteered to go to China as a medic and served there for most of that year. He was then assigned to the Pentagon in late 1944. There, he met Jean Brosh from Nebraska. So she was working as a secretary at the FBI headquarters in D.C., and they dated and quickly got married in November of 1944, which was pretty common during the war. You know, you meet someone, you fall in love, you're like, let's make this official right now because who knows what's going to happen soon.
Yeah, with the war, I think everyone was like, is the world ending? Let's go ahead and get married because it might be.
Exactly. Yeah. But Arthur was discharged in 1945, and he returned with Jean to Wisconsin. So by 1947, they had their son Brian, and Arthur was going to Northern Illinois College of Optometry. So Arthur would drive to Chicago for his classes during the week and return on the weekends until he graduated in 1949. And they did return to Green Bay for him to practice, and he worked hard and became highly regarded in the community. And he also found success in his business because he took a risk on selling a new vision product, which was the contact lens. So clearly that risk paid off, and it was very well utilized. So the family also later had Terry Jo and Renee. So they grew up in a nice house near the grounds of a country club, and Arthur spoke to them often about his travels and sailing. He really wanted them to appreciate adventure and realize that travel is the best education. Jean was a homemaker who worked hard to make her family's life beautiful and secure. She also loved gardening, adventuring with like food, serving the family different types of food. She also took art lessons and turned her recreation room into a room for entertaining. She decorated it with paintings and artifacts that Arthur had brought back from Southeast Asia. And the Duperraults were all athletic and loved the outdoors. Arthur and Brian would frequently golf together, and Jean also enjoyed playing golf, especially with her friends. She actually won the club's Vice President's Golf Cup in 1960, and she was elected president of the Shorewood Club's women's organization. Arthur also enjoyed playing handball. So handball is where players use their hands to hit a small rubber ball against a wall such that their opponent cannot hit it without it touching the ground twice or going out of bounds. And in early 1961, he actually won the state handball doubles championships. So both Arthur and Jean were very involved in their community. They were also very involved in their children's lives. Arthur would help out when the kids were sick. Jean actually gave Terry Jo stitches one time, which, like, good for you. I would panic and could never, but that's pretty amazing.
Mm-hmm.
So Brian resembled his mother and played the piano. He was quite artistic, and some of his drawings won ribbons at local fairs. And Brian also loved to build things and used the woodshed by the house as a workshop. So Renee had brown eyes and brown hair, unlike Brian and Terry Jo. Renee loved to wear dresses. She was quiet, very shy. She loved playing with her dolls, playing dress up, and playing with the neighborhood children.
When I was doing this research, I was like, because Arthur and Jean are just involved in like absolutely everything. So then I was like, oh, I guess that's what it was like in like the 50s when there was like no TV and not really books and not all this other shit just consuming our time. It was like to meet people and like have activities, you just had to go out and like do stuff. You know what I mean?
That is
like,
true. Yeah.
And like with like Brian's like drawings, and I'm like, yeah, he probably drew all the time because he didn't have all the toys and the tablets and everything like as a kid. So I'm like, what a different time, you know?
Yeah,
What a different time.
True. That is
you had to
true.
get your hobbies somewhere else because there was nothing in the house.
Yeah, you're not scrolling Instagram, you're not listening to or making your podcast, you're not catching up on your TV shows. You just got to get out in the world.
Yeah. You're just out in the world.
You can't binge 12 hours of a TV show. Like maybe you can watch the news and a few cartoons and that's it.
And while it was great for that time, I'm happy with the day and age I live in because social interacting, that's a lot. But it sounds like a lot of fun though.
Yeah, I mean, that is true. But as you heard from the beginning of this podcast, our brains are fried after a full weekend of social interaction. So I can't even imagine how we would do all of these things as well.
Yeah.
But also Jean was a homemaker, so she didn't have to do all these things in addition to working a 40-hour-a-week job because this world was not designed to not have anyone taking care of all of those important things. Anyway, that's beyond the point. But
being a stay-at-home mom or a homemaker is also a full-time job. So
Yes. I'm saying that like
Not in
that.
addition to.
Yes, I'm saying that in America today, you don't get to have someone do all of those jobs
Hmm.
solely. Like you have to work your job for pay and then also do all of those jobs versus,
Yeah.
60, 70 years ago, the men got to work their jobs for pay and the women got to do the other work that still gets done today just for free and no
Yeah.
recognition and no I'm trying to say. We have to do
I
both
just didn't
now, is
want
what I'm
anyone
saying.
to interpret it as us saying homemakers
No,
weren't. Yeah.
not at all. I was saying the exact opposite. I was saying the exact
Yeah.
opposite that like that was recognized as work then and is not
Hmm.
now, as
Yeah.
it, but it should be now. Yes. So back to this family. Terry Jo was tall, slim, and also quiet. She was a strong swimmer. She liked ice skating, water skiing, horseback riding, and unlike her parents and Brian, Terry Jo did not like to play golf and preferred to stay at home with Renee or play by herself. So Terry Jo loved animals and kept several rabbits, 2 dogs, and 5 cats at home. She was constantly bringing in stray animals. She started a pet cemetery and planted flowers on the graves of her deceased pets. Terry Jo also loved playing in the woods and creating adventures. She loved Tarzan. She even made herself a fur loincloth similar to the one that Tarzan wore. So by 1961, they were financially stable enough to make their dream a reality. So on November 8th, 1961, Arthur and his family were able to board the Bluebelle in Fort Lauderdale to pursue this dream of their cruise. So the Bluebelle was a 2-masted, 115 horsepower Chrysler sailboat. It was originally built as a yacht boat, so it was long, low, and narrow. It had a large main cabin, a main bedroom, and an aft sleeping department. So it was the perfect size for this family. And at this point in time, Brian was 14, Terry Jo was 11, and Renee was 7. So Arthur and Jean had been able to get the kids out of school for the fall semester and promised that they would ensure the kids studied on the boat, and Jean did plan to tutor them. So their plan was to go for a week and then extend the trip if everything seemed to be going well. Also accompanying the Duperraults was Julian Harvey, who was acting as skipper, and his wife, Mary Dean. So Harvey was a retired Air Force lieutenant colonel and a veteran bomber and fighter pilot. He was born in 1917 in New York. His parents divorced when he was 1, and he lived with his mom until she remarried. His stepfather was well off and was very generous to him, but when the Depression hit, his mom and stepfather could no longer afford to care for him, so he went to live with an uncle by marriage. They spoiled him, but he did have 2 challenges. He was physically weak and had a stammering problem whenever he was anxious or agitated, and he also had a lazy eye that would become more pronounced for the same reasons. So he graduated from Great Neck High School on Long Island, New York in 1937. And in 1939, he went to the University of North Carolina for engineering. He transferred to Purdue, and then in August of 1941, he decided to join the Army Air Corps. He was briefly married to a woman named Ethel, and they had a son, Julian Jr. They divorced in 1945, and he then married Joan Boylan in 1948. So they married quickly and had a son named Lance, but he would continue to sleep with other women while he was married. Then in April of 1949, he was driving back with his wife and mother-in-law, and the car crashed, and his wife and mother-in-law were trapped as it sank into a bayou. So the scene in general was a bit suspicious because, like, how did he get out and they didn't? A few did report that he didn't help them after he escaped, but there are different rumors, and he was able to collect the life insurance. So no one really knows exactly what happened with that situation, but maybe he did not do all he could to save them.
Yeah. So like basically he said like, oh, as the car was like crashing, I was able to open the door, but they were like, okay, but the door was closed when we found the car and the window was down. So why was the window down? And like people were rumored to say like we saw him just standing there like watching it sink, like he didn't like help.
Wow.
But
Yeah.
it's like there was nothing like
To prove.
sufficient, but I
Yeah.
know his like father-in-law was like, this man is a murderer, like arrest him. But everyone else was like, it's just an accident.
Yeah. Yeah. And Harvey did go on to marry a few other women after this as well. So he's been married quite a few times. So during his 19-year military career, he had received both the Distinguished Flying Cross and the Air Medal for actions as a B-24 bomber pilot in World War II. He was known to be a great and skilled pilot. And once retiring from the Air Force in 1958, he moved to Florida and loved to sail. So he was a regular at local marinas and yacht clubs. He owned his own boat for a while, but had to sell it due to financial reasons, so he started to work as a deckhand. Determined to be a sailing yacht master, he signed on to be a charter skipper on the Bluebelle, and he was 44 years old. He did work out frequently and had even briefly been a male model before joining the Air Force. And he had married 34-year-old Mary Dean Jordan on July 26, 1961. Mary was from Wisconsin. She was a TWA flight attendant the summer before they got married. So from all accounts, the trip was going smoothly, and there was little friction between the families through the first 5 days. The family was taking in the beautiful views from the Bluebelle. They would go to the islands nearby. They would take the dinghy and explore the reefs, and Renee liked to play on the beaches and dig in the sand and collect shells. One evening, they anchored at Sandy Point and went into town. They explored and chatted with locals. Arthur loved Sandy Point so much that he wanted to build a vacation home, and he wanted to come back and use that as their winter resort. And Harvey picked up a supply of fresh water while they were there. They all mailed letters to be sent back home. And in one letter, Mary was complaining to her mother about how she was never able to be alone on the ship or the beaches, and that she just wanted some alone time and didn't enjoy having to wake up early and cook breakfast. But her mother also said that in general, she seemed upbeat and was not too distraught and was mostly exaggerating with the complaints. She did say that the Duperraults were lovely and the children were well behaved.
I mean, I'm sure it's hard too because like you're just on this boat because your husband was hired and you're like,
Yeah.
I'm around this family I don't really know, and I'm kind of this isn't really what I wanted to do. I'm kind of just along for the ride here. So you're like, why can't I get a moment alone? Why do I have to get up early and cook breakfast? Like you're just complaining because you have no one else to really talk to. Like,
yeah, exactly. So on November 12th, the Bluebelle was getting prepared to start making their way back to the U.S. the next day. A fisherman was invited onto the Bluebelle to enjoy dinner with everyone. He said it was nice and a happy ship. And on the next day, November 13th, the tanker Gulf Lion spotted the Bluebelle's dinghy towing its rubber life raft. And on the dinghy was Harvey and the body of little Renee, who he initially told them was Terry Jo. So Harvey told the Gulf Lion crew that he was the sole survivor of a tragedy. In the middle of the previous night, a sudden gust of wind had dismasted the boat. It caused the main mast to plunge down through the ship, and it went over the engine room and caused the ship to burst into flames as it slowly sank. He said he managed to get the dinghy and raft, but everyone else was trapped on board. They had ended up either tangled in the mast or jumping overboard, and after it sank, he was only able to recover the body of Renee. The captain of the Gulf Lion called the Coast Guard to report the loss of the Bluebelle. The Coast Guard launched an extensive search for any survivors or remains of the ship, and the Gulf Lion took Harvey to Nassau, and the crew had gathered $180 to give him. He flew back to Miami the next day, and he was asked to appear on November 16th for an inquiry into the loss of the Bluebelle and the presumed death of all aboard. Harvey seemed in good spirits when he arrived. Before questioning, he asked about the search for any survivors and seemed kind of nervous at this point. However, the search thus far had been fruitless with no survivors and also, strangely, no debris from the lost vessel. So, nothing. They placed Harvey under oath and asked him to give his account of what happened, and it was recorded. Harvey seemed under great pressure at this point and began stuttering, which his obvious discomfort could also just be from telling like what happened to his wife and the Duperraults and how they died. He said no one was hit by the mast, but Mary and Jean had been cut on the legs by splinters. He said he tried to keep everyone calm and start the engine. He saw a fire had started in the cockpit, and then he saw the water was a foot deep in the hold. Water was rushing in, which made it hard to maintain footing, and flames were also shooting up through vents in the cockpit and spreading quickly. He tried to use the extinguishers, but with little effect. He decided to get the dinghy and rubber life raft, and he said they saw him do this, but they all decided to jump overboard rather than wait for him to get the boat. He rowed it to the stern, but it was dark, and he couldn't see anything in the water. He said the Bluebelle was going down fast, and he shouted until he was hoarse, but no sounds came back. Eventually, he found Renee, who was floating face down in the water. He tried to perform CPR, but with no luck. He said he stayed for another 2 hours, but no luck. Then he eventually was found by the Gulf Lion. So the lieutenant, hearing the story, thought some of it was quite odd. Several times he did say things like, I did this by myself, but why would you be saying that if you were obviously alone? They're like, maybe it was just a cover for having contributed through negligence. Maybe he was feeling guilty as the skipper who is in charge of the passenger's safety. But it was also later found out that this was the third time in 6 years that Harvey had lost a ship, which is not a great track record.
Not at all.
But this was also the first time that he had lost any passengers. The lieutenant also wondered how a mast could pierce a deck, as Harvey said it had. And he was like, if the Bluebelle caught fire, why hadn't the Great Stirrup Cay lighthouse, which was only a few miles away, have seen the blaze? What's going on here? Also, why didn't Harvey take the dinghy to the lighthouse? He was an experienced sailor, so he would know that there was this lighthouse nearby. But even though these things were kind of odd, there was no evidence to counter his story and no reason to be suspicious of him. He was known to be a reliable war hero. The lieutenant asked a few follow-up questions, like why he hadn't used the flares. Harvey said he didn't think of them at the time, which was also shocking for someone who was a regular sailor. Like, that's not the kind of thing that you would just forget. The lieutenant asked about the carbide water light and why he pulled the plug on it. Harvey said he didn't, and he said that he was told all you do is just throw it overboard, which also shocked the lieutenant. So a carbide water lamp is a standard piece of equipment, especially for sailors of large seagoing craft. So it's a lamp with two chambers, an upper one that contained water and a lower one that contained chunks of calcium carbide. It also it dripped slowly and burned brightly so that it could be used as an emergency light. So Harvey, by his own account, was an experienced sailor. So how would he like not understand how to use this light? Like, that just does not make sense.
Yeah, and they were saying like this light isn't really like common anymore, but like at this time, if you were the skipper or sailing anything like that, like you would know how to use it, what it's for,
Yeah.
basically. He was also saying how he could hear Terry Jo screaming and how their screams haunted him. While he was telling this story, someone came rushing into the room with big news. So while Harvey's telling his story on November 16th, Nicholas Spekdecki, I'm sorry, I know that's probably wrong. It's a Greek name. I couldn't find a pronunciation. He was the second officer of the Greek freighter Captain Theo. And so he was scanning the waters of the Northwest Providence Channel, which is like a strait that divides two major islands in the Bahamas. And something caught his eye they thought like looked kind of different. So he continued to watch the tiny speck and decided to investigate. And as they got closer, they were stunned to see it was a small life float. And sitting on that life float was a blonde-haired girl. She was looking up and waving. And one of the crewmen actually took a picture of her looking up from the float. And this photo later made it like on the cover of Life magazine. It was shared around the world, which in the 60s is a big deal. Like, you can still see the picture today. Like, a pretty like big picture from this whole story. So the crew hurried to try and get her up on the ship. Her lips were puffy, her skin was badly burned, and her eyes were dull. Her hair was bleached almost white, and her cheeks were sunken in. She couldn't stand due to being severely dehydrated, so they tried to give her water and like some orange juice. They also put salt on her body with damp towels and like Vaseline on her chapped lips. I think the salt on her body must have been like a sunburn remedy from back in the 60s or something, like something to try and help with like the burns. So the captain tried to talk to her, but she did not respond. She was mostly like comatose almost. So he kept being like, what's your name? Like, I need to call the Coast Guard. What's your name? And she was eventually able to say Bluebelle, and eventually was able to say her name was Jo Duperrault. But her throat was like really raspy. And she then just slipped into unconsciousness. So the captain remembered hearing on the radio about looking for the Bluebelle. So he telegraphed to the Coast Guard in Miami. So Terry Jo had survived for 4 days without water in the sun while balancing herself on a 2.5 by 5 foot float. So a very tiny, tiny float, like not a raft, not anything, like a float.
4
And it was
days with no water, like in the
in
sun,
the
and
sun,
wow.
on the ocean. Yeah. So it was designed to hold people like for a few hours. Like maybe if you jump off the boat, you can float around for a little bit, but it's not designed to be on for days. So the Coast Guard gave medical advice on how to help her and said a helicopter would be coming to transport her. So when Harvey heard the news of Terry Jo's survival in the room, he said, "Oh my God, isn't that wonderful?" Harry then got up and looked out the window for a few seconds and then he left. The lieutenant, just after hearing Harvey's story, being suspicious and all that, he was like, "Can we put a security guard outside Terry Jo's hospital room? Like, I have a bad feeling. It's just a gut feeling. Can we just protect her because I'm nervous?"
Mm-hmm.
So the day after Harvey left, shortly before noon, a maid knocked on the door of room 17 at the Sandman Hotel in Miami. So no one answered. And the maid opened the door and she smelled like a slight odor. And she saw like a little bit of blood on the sheets. And she was like, "It's a weird motel room. Like I smell weird stuff all the time, like
Oh
you don't
no.
even want to think about what they have to smell." But
Very
so
true.
then she tried to open the bathroom to like collect the used towels and couldn't open the door. It wasn't like locked, but it was like something was blocking it. And now she was like, "The smell is significantly more noticeable. It smells like blood. Like I'm smelling blood, basically." So she screamed, and the motel manager came in, and he was also unable to get like the bathroom door open. So they called the police, and an officer was able to push it open enough where he could stick his head in, and he found Julian Harvey covered in blood. Harvey had written a letter about his love for his 14-year-old son Lance and asked arrangements be made for the family watching him to adopt him. And he sealed the envelope and on the back wrote "cremate and bury at sea," but then he like crossed out the cremate and just underlined like "bury at sea." So Julian Harvey died by suicide in his motel room by cutting his thigh, ankle, and throat with a double-edged razor. So brutal
Wow.
way to go. But so they obeyed his wishes and did bury him at sea. But they're not sure why Harvey made this decision. Is it because Terry Jo is going to contradict his story, or is he feeling such overwhelmed guilt of what happened and grief from the loss of his wife and of the family? And Terry Jo was alive the whole time and he didn't see her and she might not survive. Like, is it all this guilt that's just building up? Or,
Mm-hmm.
why did this happen? So Terry Jo was in a coma still in the hospital. Her heartbeat was too fast and erratic, and it was weak. Dehydration had damaged her kidney function. Her temperature was really high, and her blood pressure was really low. And the doctor was like, "We're not going to know if she will survive until after 36 hours due to the severe dehydration." He was like, "We just have to try and get her hydrated to even know if she can survive." But she did slowly start to recover. They said it's probably because she was like young. So like younger
Yeah.
bodies help them like bounce back quicker.
Mm-hmm.
So she could slowly start eating again. And by November 19th, she had actually progressed to like a regular diet. She was smiling and acting like a normal child again. She didn't really mention her family, but like grew very attached to the doctor that was taking care of her. And the crew of the Captain Theo sent her a life-size blonde doll after they heard how hers had gone down with the Bluebelle. So she was like, "Oh, I miss like my
Aw.
doll." So these burly Greek crew of this ship got her a doll, which I
Ugh.
thought was the sweetest part of the whole story.
Yeah, absolutely love that.
So Terry Jo finally felt well enough to tell Coast Guard investigators what happened. She said it had been a happy trip overall. And on the night of the accident around 9 p.m., Terry Jo retired to the small cabin behind the main cabin and had gone to sleep alone. Usually Renee slept with her too, but that night Renee had remained on deck with the others. So at some point in the night, Terry Jo said she was woken up by the sound of screaming. She heard her brother screaming, "Help, Daddy, help." And she briefly heard like running and stamping noises, and then there was silence. So she sat there for a little bit because she was kind of like in shock of like, what's happening? You just wake up, what's going on? Um, so then after a few more minutes of hearing no noises, she crept out of her cabin. She saw her mother and brother lying in the cabin and a pool of blood on one side. So while in shock, she walked upstairs and poked her head up, and she looked toward the front of the boat and saw Harvey running towards her. And she said his eye was almost like rolling, but remember he had that like lazy eye that like made it worse when anxious or agitated. So that was probably what was going on. But to her, in the state of shock and asleep, she was like, it looked like his eye was just like rolling out of his head, basically.
Yeah.
So he struck her, shoved her roughly down the stairs, and said, "Get back down there." She went back to the cabin and tried not to look at her mother and brother. And Terry Jo climbed back into her bunk, terrified. So she knew her mother and brother were dead, but she didn't know about her father and her sister because she's not seen them. She doesn't know where they are. So she heard like water sloshing around, and she was like, "Is Harvey up there like cleaning up blood? Like, is he cleaning? Like, what is he doing up there?" But then she noticed water was coming into her cabin and that the ship was like filling with water. So Harvey came down and stood in the doorway when he then like turned and walked away. Like he just came, like stood, stared at her, turned around and like walked away. So as the water filled up, Terry Jo had to leave the cabin. So she climbed back up to like the cockpit and she saw the boat's dinghy and rubber life raft had been like launched and were floating next to the boat. So she asked, like, "Is the boat sinking?" And he's like, "Yeah, it is." And he rushed towards her and like handed her a line and was like, "Hey, can you just hold this?" And she was like, "Oh, okay. All right." So Terry Jo must have kind of distracted Harvey from his escape at this point because now the dinghy is like floating away and he's like getting angry. So he jumps overboard and swam up to the dinghy. And she remembered at this point that the boat had a white life float on top of like the main cabin. So she found it, untied it. And at one point, actually, the line, she was still holding the line that like Harvey had told her to hold. And it drug her underwater, but she was able to kind of like pop back up. And she said during all of the interactions, Harvey seemed mad and angry. She wasn't really sure how her mother and brother were attacked. She thought she saw Harvey with a rifle, and they had brought a rifle on the trip. So I guess her brother Brian had brought a rifle and like made a joke getting on the boat. He was like, "Yeah, I'm gonna go like shoot at the sharks." And they were like, "Yeah, this is just like a 60s kid thing." Like no, like no one really like thought it was anything weird.
Yeah.
So there was a rifle like on the boat though, and she thought he had it. So they asked Terry Jo about the masks, and she said the sails were like slack, but the masks were still up. So like Harvey was saying like all the masks came down, but she's like, no, like the sails weren't up, but they were still intact. So now Harvey's story is not true based on Terry Jo's account. And she said she'd also seen blood on the deck near the cockpit, and she said she did not see fire at any point. So she's kind of contradicting what Harvey was saying. So Terry Jo had floated alone for 4 days with no food, no water, no cover against the cold of night or the heat of the day. So it's like really hot during the day, really cold at night. And she had to fight hard to hold on to the raft through the waves of the ocean. So it's not like she could just like lay in a raft. Like she's having to balance herself the whole time. So she didn't know if her sister and her father were still alive. And she said she would just pray to survive and then pray that her father had survived. She just kept being like, "Please just let my dad be okay. Like, please just tell me he survived." She said when she was floating at sea, she could see the lights of other ships, but they were too far away. Like she couldn't get their attention.
Oh, that had to be so heartbreaking that it's just like you
Yeah.
see them and you know they're right there, but you have no way of letting them know that you are there. Oh,
Yeah, like you
gosh.
can't scream. No one's going to hear it. Like you know they're there and you're so close, but like you can't do anything.
Yeah.
And she would try to get her body in the water to help from like the heat of the day. But then these little like parrotfish would come and like peck at her and like peck at her like legs and her butt, just kind of peck at her. And they kept following her around. So like the whole time she's floating, these little fish are just following her the whole time. So she would try to like smack them and like get them away. And she fell asleep at one point and like fell into the water. And thankfully she still had her arm around it. So it like she kept afloat, but like again, like even falling asleep could lead to her drowning or losing that float.
Yeah.
And she's 11. We remind you, 11 years old. So she had seen planes that were sent out for the search after Harvey was found. However, it was kind of hard to see her because she's on a white float in a white blouse and like her blonde hair, which was almost white. So she resembled the white caps at sea, which is just like foam from the waves. So from that high of a like point, it just kind of looks like a white cap. And that's what the Captain Theo, like Nicholas thought it was until he was like, it's not moving. That's kind of weird. So like people may have like been like, oh, that looks weird, but not known what it is.
And like you said, it's such a small raft too. It's not like she's out there on this like 12-foot thing that is like easily, it's like, oh, this tiny little thing and this tiny little human. So that makes sense.
Yeah. And not only did Terry Jo have to worry about the sun and no food or water, but also predators in the sea like sharks and barracudas. Like she's in the ocean. And she would start to kind of like drift in and out of consciousness. And then finally, thankfully, the Captain Theo spotted her and rescued her. And they were like, if it had been like one more day, she probably wouldn't have survived. Because like 4 days without water is like max you can go.
Absolutely.
After hearing Terry Jo's story, everyone knew that Harvey was lying and this was not an accident. Because they were like, Terry Jo has no reason to make up a story. Like, what would you, why would she do that?
Exactly. And the evidence that she does have like disproves what he said happened with like the mast and everything. So it's like, yeah.
Yeah. So they let Terry Jo have a break from the questioning, and she was able to enjoy Thanksgiving with her aunt and uncle. And on November 27th, the Coast Guard returned to ask her more questions. She said again, all the masts were up. She said they were possibly leaning, which this could be from like the boat sinking too. But she said all the wires holding up the masts were intact. She said she doesn't remember Harvey being mad at anyone on the boat or angry. Like she doesn't remember anything before this. And she did say it was possible he hurt her family. Like she didn't see it, but I mean, there's only so many people who could have done it. Only one other person was found alive, you know.
Yeah.
And Harvey had also said that Terry Jo was in Jean's lap when everything happened, but that's not true. She was asleep, and this maybe could be him like confusing Terry Jo and Renee, which I don't really understand. One has brown hair, one has blonde hair. You've been with this family for like 6 days at this point. I think you might remember which kid is which a little bit. And after this second interview, they were convinced Harvey lied about everything. They believed Terry Jo 100%. She had nothing to hide, nothing to make up. She was just telling it exactly as she remembers. She's not, has no other agenda. She's just telling what she remembers. So Terry Jo was finally discharged from the hospital and flew back with her aunt and uncle. With the help of her relatives, she wrote back to all the letters she'd received from around the world. Bohemian authorities did an autopsy on Renee's body, and her cause of death was found to be drowning. And it's undetermined if it was like incidental drowning or accidental drowning. They found bruises on her left elbow, but besides that, there's not a lot of evidence of trauma. And they also don't know if Renee was still alive when Harvey left with her in the dinghy. So they don't really know at what point she would have drowned. And investigators also found that shortly before the Bluebelle voyage, Harvey had taken out a $20,000 life insurance policy on Mary Dene, with himself as the beneficiary, which in today's money is $204,000. So that's a big old life insurance policy.
Yeah.
And it also had a double indemnity clause that meant a payoff of $40,000 if she died accidentally, which is $408,000 in today's money. So again, with he has no children, like she has no children. Why do you need this much money?
Yeah.
That's suspicious. And Harold Pegg, who was the owner of the Bluebelle, also noticed that Harvey had scratches on his arms when he'd been discovered. He said it was from the wires from the fallen masts, but obviously we know that's not true because Terry Jo told us all the wires were still intact. However, Mary Dene's brothers remember she had very long fingernails, so many wonder if they were like defensive wounds of her fighting back. So Terry Jo eventually changed her name to Terry, but spelled it like T-E-R-E, because she'd been known for so long as like brave little Terry Jo, and she just kind of wanted to break apart from that time of her life.
Which is very understandable.
like you're known across the world as like, oh, little brave Terry Jo. And you're just like, okay, like, can we move on? Like, not
Yeah.
move on, but you know what I mean? Like, I don't want that to be my reputation.
You want to be known for something else in your life and have a different,
Mm-hmm.
yeah.
And in 1999, Terry also agreed to take the truth serum or sodium amytal. So it's not really truth serum, but it is like a sedative that kind of like relaxes a person and it can reduce inhibitions against recalling anxiety provoking memories. So it can be used for this because it kind of like relaxes your body and lets your brain maybe go in places that it's been trying not to go. So during this interview, Terry had a larger amount of clarity than in previous interviews. So she also recalled a number of additional details. She remembered her mom laying dead in her clothes, not pajamas, and Brian was in his pajamas. So that to them meant Jean had not yet gone to bed, but Brian had by the time the attack happened. She also thought this like sloshing of water and splashing she heard was water coming into the boat and not like Harvey cleaning up the boat. So she was like, I actually think it was this instead. Terry also remembered Harvey having a pail, but under the sodium amytal, she remembered it being a gas can instead. So he'd already been like planning the dinghy when she came up. So it's likely that Renee was already in the dinghy at this point. And it's somewhat believed that Harvey knew Renee had died by drowning and brought her with him to prove his accident story. So they don't really know, like, did he see her drown and take her, or did he drown her himself? But they were like, this is why we think he brought Renee, because it could be like, see, like, you're going to do the autopsy. She died by drowning. There's no trauma, proving my story of what happened.
Mm-hmm. And then he can also be like, look, like I tried to save her. Like I'm still bringing her with me just in case something can be done,
Mm-hmm.
Something along
She's the
those
only one I
lines.
could save. I wanted to bring her body back.
Yep.
It's also believed that Harvey likely planned to kill his wife to get the insurance money, and they think he was planning to kill her quietly and slip her overboard. He would say she's missing, he'd get this accidental life insurance claim, and things would move on. But they think possibly Arthur heard the sounds of the fight and came to confront him, and this is when Harvey likely stabbed him and Jean shortly after that. And they think Jean was likely on her way to protect Renee when Harvey stabbed her. Stabbed Jean, that is, to add that up. And they think Brian woke at the sounds above, and that's when he calls like to his dad for help. Then all this commotion woke up Terry Jo, but she stayed in the cabin for a few minutes. She said maybe 10 to 15 minutes after she started hearing noises. So while she was in there, they think Harvey stabbed Brian and put him next to Jean, and this is when Harvey starts making his plan for the escape on the dinghy and sinking the Bluebelle. And it actually took Terry 19 years before she opened up to anyone about the Bluebelle. So basically, when she came back, her aunt and uncle were like trying to protect her, and they just asked all the friends, the teachers, like, please don't bring it up at all. Like, let's just not talk about it. And this is the 60s, so I don't want to be too harsh on her aunt and uncle because I think they were doing what they thought was best for her.
Mm-hmm.
I know if we look at it now, obviously that's not best, but I think they were doing it out of love and not out of resentment. I listen to a lot of true crime podcasts who like to really heavily critique, especially on old cases. And it's like, it's the 60s. Nobody talked about anything. We still have people today who'd be like, don't talk about it at all. Like, you kind of have to think about it. Like, this is not done maliciously. They're not like, let's bury it. Let's not talk about it. They're thinking, she doesn't need to talk about it or think about it. Let's pretend it never happened kind of thing.
Yeah, like times were different then. Like we have different like research now. And then it was like, oh, if we just like don't talk about it, like she'll slowly forget and it'll be fine.
Mm-hmm.
And now we know that's not the case, but they didn't know that then. So they were doing what they thought was best.
Yeah. So don't want to like anyone to be like, how dare that aunt and uncle tell her not to think about like it's a different time. Like that's at that time what they thought was best.
Mm-hmm.
And it's also possible that Terry didn't want to speak about it as well. Like we don't know if she wanted to talk about it, if she had the coping skills to even talk about it. And it would be like 25 years before Terry even let herself feel anger about what Harvey had done. So it took her a really long time to like talk about it and accept the anger and like the emotions that come with it. She definitely had PTSD, but that had not been widely recognized. I don't think it was talked about at all at this point. Like talking about trauma and all that is a very way in the future topic.
Yeah.
So
yeah,
I think
sure.
I think in the book it said like PTSD wasn't even like really known as a thing that was
Yeah.
like could be common. So Terry did end up getting some money after her family sued Harold Pegg. So he'd hired Harvey as like the skipper, as like the master of the ship when he didn't have a master's license. So he also didn't have any licensing to be on the Bluebelle. And the settlement was large enough to create a trust fund for Terry. And so she chose to attend a private school where she could start new because she was like, I'm sick of being just like everyone's looking at me with like pity eyes. But unfortunately, it was spread around there as well who she was. So she decided to return to public school near her aunt and uncle. Terry remembered how her father wanted them to travel, so she went to University of Wisconsin Stevens Point to study Spanish. And the summer after freshman year at 19, she went to Spain and she just fell in love with Spain and thought it was beautiful. It was amazing. But she did eventually drop out of college because she was like, I don't really feel like this is going to fulfill me in life. So she decided to become an x-ray technician and she wanted to like help people, but she could not stand blood anymore after seeing the blood there. Totally makes sense. So she was like, I
Yeah.
can't be a doctor or a nurse and deal with that, but an x-ray technician, I can do that. I can do that
Yeah.
part.
Makes sense.
So Terry married John Saturimus in 1971, and they had a daughter, Brooke, in 1974, but they divorced a few months after this. And she stayed very close with like him and his family after that. Like they got divorced, but she was still on good terms like with his family.
Mm-hmm.
She met Spencer Hill and married him in 1976. They had their daughter Blair the same year. She also had a son who she named Brian after her late brother in 1978. In 1979, Spencer was in the army and was stationed in Germany, so the whole family went. And it was around this time she kind of finally started opening up and talking about like her family's death. Like she went to like her like kids like doctor's appointment and they like asked a question. They were like, oh, like, how did your parents die? And she was like, oh, they were tragically murdered by a man. And they were like, maybe you should talk to somebody. Like,
Right. You're
maybe
like,
you should
oh,
talk to
and
someone.
okay. Yeah.
Yeah. So that's kind of around the time she was like, oh, okay, let me start talking about this. So she chose to leave Germany and go back to the US with her children. And she ended up filing for divorce from Spencer, who kind of had an ongoing addiction problem. So Terry moved back to Green Bay and eventually went back to school at University of Wisconsin, Green Bay. She was married again around this time, but she prefers not to speak of him because he was not a good man. A lot of really bad revelations came out of him, like abusing children. She said that he never abused her children, but other children. So she's like, we just don't talk about him. He's gone.
Yeah.
And she had some troubles through the years, but she stayed strong and took good care of her children. She remained really close with her relatives and friends. And despite the horrific event, she really stayed strong through her life. And she tried to find ways to like overcome battles and not be bitter towards people or experiences. Like she tried to just keep having like a more positive outlook and not kind of be jaded from everything. Her daughter, Blair, in a 1999 interview, said her mom was her hero. And in 1990, she met Ronald Fassbender at a job she was at. She was still married to her third husband, but that marriage was quickly dissolving. As we said, he was not a good guy. So she confided in Ron a lot at work, and he'd always like listen and try to help her where he could. In 1995, she decided to move to Wilmington, North Carolina to get away for a little bit. She actually went to stay with her first husband's family. Like I said, they were still pretty close. So her now ex-husband was being released from prison. And she was like, I need to get away from that bad guy. I need to be safe with my children for a while. And Ron actually came to visit her in North Carolina. And they both were like, oh, like we're in love. Like this is we're supposed to be together. Like, we're
Mhm.
not just friends at this point.
Yeah.
So they officially got together Thanksgiving of 1995. And in 2001, they moved to Kewaunee, Wisconsin, and retired. So Terry struggled for many years after the horrific attack. She struggled through adolescence and she had a few failed marriages, but she always remained strong. And in the book, she said she's finally in a good place and she's very happy with her life. She has grandchildren and she remains really close with Brooke, Blair, and Brian. So she kind of had a very big tragedy, but she stayed close with her aunt and uncle. She was really close with her grandmother, like still had like her relatives around her, and now she has her children and grandchildren, and she just feels like at a good point in her life. And it's still unknown why Harvey decided to leave Terry Jo alive while he murdered everyone else. He obviously already killed Brian, so he already killed a child, and we don't know if he intentionally drowned Renee, but he was responsible for it. So we don't know if maybe he was like, oh, she'll drown in the boat, it's fine, or no one really knows why. But we can suspect that he killed the rest of the Duperraults when they found out his plans to kill his wife. So that's kind of what everyone thinks, especially since he died by suicide soon after Terry Jo was found. He definitely had a huge part in this. So that is the horrific murders of Arthur, Jean, Brian, and Renee Duperrault and Mary Dean Harvey.
Wow. What a story. I mean,
so sad.
yeah.
And also, like, thank goodness for the book that she co-wrote with that guy, because I thought this was going to be a 30-minute episode, because I was like, I can't find any information anywhere. This is from the 60s.
Wow.
And then I read the book, and now it's, how long are we going on? A long time.
And now we have all the things we need to know.
But especially with like no information about, like, if you look it up, there's no information about the Duperraults whatsoever, or Terry, or like anything about their like personal life. So it's like, book was a good purchase. And go read it, because there's a lot more detail about, lot more detail about Julian Harvey, but I didn't really want to get too much into that, because fuck that guy. I gave the briefest overview I could of his life, but it gave a lot more detail.
The book written?
That's a good question.
Oh, sorry.
1 second. Okay, it says published in 2010. I don't know if it's like a re-release or that's the original.
Okay, gotcha. Just curious.
Yeah, everything on the Amazon site is saying 2010. So
the Amazon,
the Amazon site,
everything on the Amazon,
the
Amazon.
Google. Let me look at the Goodreads and see if it gives more insight.
There we go.
Okay, yeah. First published 2010. So
okay, gotcha.
Not that long ago, but a long way after.
Yeah, I didn't know if it was like, I know you said it took her a while to talk about it, so I assumed it wasn't immediately after. I mean, obviously she was a child, but like I assumed it wasn't a long time ago, but I didn't know like how recent it was. But
yeah, because it wasn't until 1999, which this happened in 61. So it wasn't until 1999 that she like took the quote unquote truth serum and kind of talked more about this. So I mean, at that point, that's almost 40 years later.
Yeah.
So
wow, what an incredible story, and just so tragic, but like the way she was able to survive for 4 days with no food, no water,
on a tiny little loaf, like think of when you go to the lazy river and that tiny little float, and sitting on that in the ocean for 4 days, and it's
in the
hot
middle
as
of
hell
the ocean
during the day, and then they said it got to like freezing temperatures at night. So she would go from this extreme heat to this extreme cold, no food, no water. She's like barely able to stay conscious because she has no food, no water.
Like you said, like if you fall asleep and you risk losing your only float, and obviously you can't tread water for days to stay alive, like, so you either lose your float or you just drown, or like, I mean, truly crazy that she was able to stay alive.
And an absolute miracle.
Yeah.
that boat saw her and was like, let me go check this out.
Yes,
Like
definitely.
a complete miracle.
Wow. All right. So not going to chat too long since I know we are at a long length here currently. I don't know what words just came out of my mouth. Courtney, what is your perk of the week?
So my perk of the week is I just got back from Nashville. We went to go see Ed Sheeran with my mom. That was her Mother's Day gift, is we got her tickets to see it. And he just puts on like a really amazing show. It was really good. He apparently broke a ticket sale record for Nissan Stadium. So a lot of people there. He had like a stage that was like in the center, so he could like sell out the entire stadium basically. Yeah. And like the stage would like rotate also. So he was like spinning, and I was like, how are you not getting seasick? But he was like spinning and stuff, but it was really, really cool.
That's a nice way to do it, where like everyone actually gets to see and not just, you know, oh, I'm stuck in this shitty angle and the entire time I'm not going to see anything. Yeah.
And he had a bunch of different little like screens and stuff too. So he was like up on the screens, but yeah, that way he's like constantly spinning. So everyone at some point is seeing him like straight on. So it was an amazing show and it was an amazing time. It was just fun to hang out with, you know, my parents, my dad and Kevin got to go drink on Broadway while we were at the show. They dropped us off at the gate and picked us up at the gate too after the show. But, yeah, it was a lot of fun. Yeah. It was just a great trip, and it's always fun to hang out with family. So that is my perk of the week. Jacqueline, what is your perk of the week?
Yeah, it sounded like you guys had a lot of fun. So my perk of the week, we also went out of town this weekend. We went to Cincinnati for the day to see a Cincinnati Reds game. So that was a lot of fun. It was me and my husband and my daughter and my aunt and my cousin and my cousin's girlfriend. And so we all went up there for the day, and we rented a minivan, which was nice. So we could like all drive together and not have to take two separate cars. So that, you know, always makes it more of like a fun road trip versus having to, you know, was it caravan when you like follow people or whatever.
Yeah, that's always hard. And then someone has to pee and you have to text and be like, hey, I got to pee. Can you stop at an exit? Exactly. Can you do this? You know.
And a lot of coordination and, well, do you guys want to do this? You spend a lot of time on the phone. You know, it's just a lot. And it was also nice to like have a little mini road trip and have other people to entertain my daughter other than just myself. So I got to finish a book in the car last night. So that was nice. But which she also fell asleep because it was midnight by that point. But yeah. So
I would hope she was asleep at that point. It's a long time.
Yeah.
Past her bedtime.
Very much so. And so the baseball game was super fun, and it was my daughter's first baseball game, so she had a blast. She also really much enjoyed riding the trolley that she keeps calling the bus because, you know, it kind of looks like a bus, but we rode it from where we parked to the game. And so then if you ask her like, oh, like, how was the game? Like, what did you do? You know, those things. And she's like, I rode a bus. So that's the most exciting part of the day for her. So
yeah, that's the highlight.
Yeah, but that was my perk of the week. It was just a fun little day trip to see a baseball game and just to have a good, like you said, just a fun little trip with family. So it's very nice. If you guys want to tell us about your trips, if you guys knew this story, I've never heard of this story. I looked up the picture as Courtney was talking that was on Life magazine, and you know, that the very famous picture, which I've never seen, but I did look that up. And of course we will post that on the Instagram, but let us know if you guys knew about this, you know, if you guys have any additional thoughts, all that good stuff. You guys know where to find us, and we are also on patreon.com/caffeinatedcrimes, where you can find all kinds of bonus episodes and quarterly gifts and pins and stickers in our Discord channel, and just lots of other fun little perks that we wish you will consider joining us over there.
Yeah, and in a few weeks, we're going to be at CrimeCon. Yes. So we'd love to see you there. If you're going to be there, just let us know if you've already bought your tickets. Any cool hangout spots you know of. But we'll be there, and hopefully we'll see you, and hopefully we'll be passing out as many stickers as we have. So if you could also give us reviews on Apple Podcast or Spotify, just 5 stars wherever you can do that. Like, subscribe on YouTube. It would be greatly appreciated. But in the meantime, go have a cup of coffee.
And don't commit a crime.